One formally, yeah, exactly. It's all pretty bad. And well, at least we got Ira here. Maybe Bonnie too. I don't know. Oh, yes, that is the camera. Yeah, but honestly, you look whatever way you want to. I don't think that's an issue. All right, go on. Yes, exactly. You see that I have it set in such a way that nobody would actually have any concepts other than exactly.
So Dan, when did you do this original work?
So this great. It's 2012. Yeah, so it's 2013. Sorry, 2013. In school, yeah. And it's funny actually, as I was looking back, as I was trying to remember exactly what it is that I did or said. I still have my teacher's notes about it. And you guys probably won't remember her. She came my first summer when we had like what felt like the entire faculty of HUC came. And so her name is Dr. Alyssa Gray. So she teaches primarily rabbinics and codes, like codes of law. So her class is without question the hardest course on the docket. Like it's not even comparable. And she is not someone who will let you get by with anything even resembling BS. So the fact that I had minimal comments to me was like the sign that things had worked well. All right. So Dr. Lenskowski, I just want to make sure. Can you see us and hear us okay?
Perfectly okay.
Everything looks we won't hear you so well in this end because otherwise we'll get feedback. But just give me a thumbs up if you can. Thumbs up. Okay, good. I think I hear the Brombergs coming as well. All right. Well, I think why don't we get started? Judy, make sure you're turned on there.
I think I am turned on.
You are?
Yes,
very good. Okay. And if any of our strange choice of words here.
We're happy now.
Margaret, great to see you. If any of our friends online, by the way, either have any issues or want to contribute anything, the chat is probably going to be your best method for that. So you're welcome to use it anytime. We can see it appear on the screen. And Philip, I'm just going to mute you just so we don't have anything in the back there, but always great to see you. And I think, Judy, let's take it away.
Okie doke. So welcome back, everybody. This is our second year doing science and religion here at Temple Addis, Israel. It's always great to see everybody. We always want to say a big thank you to Steve Rosen, Celia Paul, who really have made this program possible for us to enjoy. So last year, among many other topics, we looked at AI, we looked at the cosmos, the healing power of music. Tonight, we are doing something a little different, but I think you will really savor this discussion. So, of course, we are here with Rabbi Dan, and our guest, she's wonderful, making another appearance with us, is Ann Silver. She's joining us to answer the burning question, is there such a thing as kosher pork? Yes, the science, ethics, and halakha of laboratory-grown meat. So before we dive in, I just want to tell you a little bit about Ann. She's a registered dietitian and a diabetes educator. She has a private practice, which has been thriving out here in the East End for many, many years, with a focus in diabetes, eating disorders, and weight management. She has been passing along her passion for healthy eating to students at Suffolk County Community College as an adjunct assistant professor for 24 years. And she has mentored many colleagues on their journey to begin their own practices while continuing to help her clients forge a healthier relationship with food. So I think we want to get started with really finding out what is the law about this topic, this very strange topic of laboratory grown meat. So Dan, I think this is your place.
All right, I'll start us off a little bit of science first, and then a little bit of halakha, of legal considerations. So first is that the impetus for this evening's conversation really goes back to, as I was explaining before, to a course I took at HUC in 2013. And we were tasked with creating what's called a she'ela u'tshuva, a question and an answer. A tshuva is a standard form of rabbinic decision in the form usually of a letter or a proclamation, or in this case, right, a sort of well-researched paper that addresses a question of concern in the Jewish community, more often than not arising from, for example, something that didn't exist when the rabbis were codifying the initial laws in the Talmud, and then eventually in the codes of law and Mishnah Torah and Shulchan Aruch and things like that later on. So, one of the great examples of it is something like electricity. right? Electricity comes into existence. The rabbis could never have conceived of it exactly, questions about its usage on Shabbat. And so rabbis usually, sort of in an appellate system, lower court rabbis eventually getting to a rabbi of significant enough repute that if they give a ruling, it then becomes an accepted ruling within the larger community, really of the diaspora then and across the world. So obviously I don't meet any of those standards at all. So everything I did in 2013 and everything I'll say tonight has to be understood with a big caveat, which is I can only present that which I understand, but I don't have, for example, the background of either a shochet, a person who's responsible for ritually slaughtering animals, or a mashgiach, a person who is responsible for overseeing all manner of cooking and preparation of either restaurant food or industrial grade food. However, the things that I researched back in 2013 are still relevant to this conversation today. And in order to understand the halacha, you have to understand at least a little bit of what exactly it is that we are talking about. So when I first came across this, I was honestly, with this assignment, I purposely picked the most preposterous thing I could find because I realized if I tried to pick something serious, I would take it too seriously and it would be a bad paper in the end. But if I pick something humorous, chances are I would find it interesting enough to go deep. And sure enough, that was the case. And so I had read an article about something referred to as shmeat at that point, which was a conflation of the words sheet and meat. And what it referred to was the process by which this idea of creating meat in a laboratory, really what it looks like. So it really involves a couple of steps. And again, this is where Anne actually, I think, is probably more up to date than I am in some of the innovations since 2013. But its main idea is some kind of muscle progenitor stem cells are taken either A, from a biopsy taken from a live animal, or B, from a piece of flesh removed from the carcass of a recently deceased animal or slaughtered animal. Okay, I know some of this is going to be, stomach churning to some degree, and that's where we'll get to in some of the conversation later about its practical application. But basic idea is in order for this to work, this is not Impossible Burger, right? It is not an attempt to make a different substance taste like meat. It is an attempt to grow edible meat separate from an animal, but it begins ultimately from cells from an animal, one way or the other. But keep in mind for our conversation around halacha, whether it is a biopsy from a living animal or taken from a slaughtered animal does have an application in some of these considerations. Okay, once we have the cells, then they are placed in a growth medium. Now, this growth medium is another complication because it can be of a non-animal nature, in other words, plant-based or chemical-based, or in some cases I read is some kind of fetal material from cows. Okay, so it can be a meat growth medium, and that again also affects the conversation quite a lot. Yeah, yes, not fecal, fetal. I said it was it's going to be stomach churning. I don't think I meant quite that much. And then ultimately, that growth medium and the stem cells are assisted by a skeletal structure of some sort, which again is attempting to create not, for example, in these cases, they're not talking about yet creating like a T-bone steak with a bone in it, but more a scaffolding really is probably a better word for it. Something for the cells to then grow around so that in the end, you have a piece of meat that actually looks like a piece of meat. So picture in your mind a flank steak, a skirt steak, something like that that is distinct from other steaks. You would be getting exactly what it's supposed to look like in the real sense. But again, these main components, stem cell or progenitor cells of some kind, a growth medium, and a scaffolding. And then once all of these things are mixed together, there is a differentiation process, the process by which less specialized cells become more specialized. In other words, the mixture of stuff becomes actual muscle cells and then combined to form muscle fibers. And that in the end is what combines to make it look and taste like the same thing. And then as a last preposterous thing, the fibers themselves then need to be exercised. In other words, in order for them to not just look like, but to taste like, they have to, in essence, be sort of, I guess the way that I saw it back then was sort of a kind of electric shock almost, the same way that if you ever use the TENS unit for your back or something like that, a shock goes in, the muscles contract, and it replicates the process of it having sort of grown in that way. So again, if everybody's stomachs are still with them, that is the the basis of it. And again, you'll jump in, as we go further into the conversation around the ethics of this, right, into some of the other ways of going about it. But that's the basic kind of structure of what you're dealing with. So yes,
Yeah.
please, good.
So it takes 4 weeks for this to happen. Okay. And now they're using bioreactors. They're taking the cell. Like there are websites that I could send you to if you're interested, but the information is so scant. Like one website for Aleph, like an Aleph Bet, Aleph Farms. I think it was Aleph, that they have a picture of Lucy, and Lucy is a cow, and they take a cell from Lucy, a cell, and that's what they're using. And then it's put into a bioreactor, but then you have to put other nutrients with it, just like and Judy, you kind of said this to me earlier, just like you would a cow or a chicken that you need to feed them. So they're adding carbs, they're adding vitamins and minerals to the substances. Like, it's not very clear on the websites, but from what I gleaned, on one of the, I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but on one of the websites, this was for Upside Foods. They make chicken. Bill Gates is involved with Upside Foods, and they make chicken, and the chicken looks like real chicken. Like, they have a piece of chicken being grilled and they slice it and it looks like real chicken. They're adding, I think it was the chicken that they're adding maltodextrin, either the Upside or the Olive. I could look at my notes. They are adding maltodextrin, which is a starch, and considering the source of the starch could be gluten containing, which could be an issue for those with celiac disease where they need to restrict their gluten intake. And then there's an enzyme called transglutaminase, and that could also affect people with celiac disease. So in terms of equivalency, it may not be exactly equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a picture on Aleph Farms of the meat. And it's interesting. It doesn't look to me as a regular piece of beef. It looks layers, like they have a little cube and it looks like layers, as though they were growing, scaffolding the meat in layers.
So, and I think in the end, as we were talking about before, and that was one of the big caveats that I put in this paper when I put it out, was that because it's an evolving technology, it's hard to issue rulings that will hold in all circumstances, precisely for the reasons that Anne just described. Because every different ingredient that gets added in, to some degree, plays a factor, especially in the consideration of the laws of kashrut, right? Whether or not things are permissible or not. So I will try to condense this down as much as I can so we can really get to some discussion. But the halakha questions are really quite fascinating, and they're a good example of the way in which halakha operates more broadly and the way that the rabbis consider questions like this. Because on the one hand, right, I titled this evening provocatively, with an intention. We knew we were up against other things. We didn't realize against the presidential debate, but we figured, kosher pork is at least an interesting enough title. But the answer to it is almost immediately obvious, which is, no, because of the fact that it's pork. And we'll get to that question last. But before you even get to that, there are actually much more relevant, much more interesting halakhic questions, as far as, things that are actually very potentially viable, right? Not so simple to say no to. And again, when we get to the conversation about ethics in the end, there are meta considerations as well in terms of the overall effect on the world, on the environment, and other things that balance up against some other halakhic considerations as well. Okay, so our main questions to address are, okay, assuming, and this is a big assumption, but let's assume that we're taking the progenitor cells from an otherwise kosher, not treif animal, right? Let's just take beef, chicken as our simplest routes, okay? So the first question is there anything from process to product in the creation of this in vitro meat, that's the other more official way of referring to it, that presents a problem vis-a-vis the laws of kashrut? Okay. In other words, if you're dealing with a kosher animal and you do things properly, can it be a kosher product? Okay. That's its fundamental big question. Second, if this is the case and we determine that it is a kosher product, is that product technically meat, or is another thing which is called parv, right? Parv is the in-between, neither here nor there. Pretty much every quality cookie you ever had on Shabbat after you had a meat meal is the definition of what parv is, right? And you can use it even to describe people, right? It is, that person who has neither here nor there. And so it's a valid question, though, right? If you're creating something that started out as meat, is it necessarily meat at the end? And again, it'll be fascinating when we get there. And then we ultimately get to the question of, if this whole process was done with a non-kosher animal, could it be made into a kosher thing to eat, right? A permissible thing to eat. So let's deal with the first question first. Okay, so assuming that we are dealing with a kosher animal, we run into the first question. Remember, there were two main methodologies for getting the progenitor cells. One was taking it as a biopsy from a living animal, and the other was taking it from a dead animal. So let's deal with the simpler of the two, the dead animal. In this case, if it was an animal that, for example, died on its own, right? What we would describe as carrion, right? Something that is just there by the side of the road. No, the answer is no. Okay, there is a general prohibition against eating carrion things. So that is a no-no right from the beginning. But the biopsy thing is more interesting because on the one hand, you would say to yourself, well, okay, it shouldn't be a problem, right? It's just a little bit of a biopsy, right? A tiny amount of the cells taken out of the animal. The animal's fine. It's not injured or anything of the sort. The problem is there is a prohibition that is Torah-based, but I think established by the rabbis, that is called Ever Min HaChai, which means that you are not permitted to eat flesh from a otherwise living animal. And apparently, historically, there were examples of, shepherds who would, and forgive me again for being graphic, right, cut off one of the limbs of the animal, but not kill it because it was still a milk-producing animal. Okay, so this was considered an abhorrent practice. And so Ever Min HaChai was a means to make sure that kind of barbarism doesn't take place. And so there is an argument to be made, right? If you take a biopsy, what are you in effect doing, right? You are taking flesh from a living animal and then consuming it while the animal continues to live. So here we get up against another interesting conversation of the rabbis, which is what counts as eating? Okay, what does one have to do in order to reach the threshold of having eaten something? And the basic, there are different size elements at play in different halachic questions, but the minimum consideration for having eaten something is a kazait. A zait is an olive. So kazait means anything that is of the olive size. Okay, so if you are dealing with a kazait's worth of this animal, then it wouldn't work because you would be violating the Ever Min HaChai consideration. You would be eating this live animal. However, at least as I argued it, in the case of taking progenitor cells from a biopsy to make this other product, and the other product is the thing we're considering, right, whether or not it's halachically viable to eat. When you think about it, right, even if you took this small amount, right, the biopsy is less than a kazait for sure. And if you think about the cells themselves and the actual amount in the end product of those original cells, it is infinitesimally smaller. And so as a result of that, my argument was that it actually would be permissible because in the end, so long as you're doing it in that way, right, taking it as a biopsy, it's smaller than an olive. And even then, you could probably make the argument that just because of its differentiation into smaller cells, technically would allow for a kosher version of this to take place. Okay, so that again is where I'm sure if you talk to other rabbis, you might end up with some disagreement on that. But as a basic concept of it, it establishes the possibility that this is a thing that could happen, right? It could work. So you take a kosher animal, you take the smallest amount you can of the cells, you use that to make this other product. And then theoretically, at least that one hurdle has been dealt with. Okay. Now, yes. Well, so there is another consideration also, right? But I think my guess is the same argument could be made about its connection to the living animal itself, right? In other words, if you're still taking something away from the animal that they would otherwise have if you didn't, and then having them continue on their own, it's a little different than a chicken egg, right? Because it would be internal to the animal as opposed to external to the animal. But it's a great question, right? And these are exactly the kinds of questions that you have to ask, because if you don't ask them, then in the end, right, you end up running afoul of other things that you don't even afoul. Boy, this is why you tune in, people. This is it. Okay, so let's assume again we've kind of got over that hurdle. Now the question of whether it's parv or not turns out to be the most fascinating part of the conversation, as far as I'm concerned. So there are basically three considerations as to determining whether this thing is meat or whether this thing is parv, right? Once the whole thing is said and done. Okay, so the three halachic issues at play. One, and don't expect any of you to remember them, other than maybe Dr. Lenskowski, who would probably know them to begin with. Okay, batel b'shishim or bitul b'shishim, which I'll explain in a second. Davar chadash, panim chadashot, and ta'am ki'ikar. Okay, so all of these things are like little phrases that speak to big principles. I'm taking them one at a time. Okay, so the first one, bitul b'shishim, is an idea that bitul levatel means for something to become basically nullified, right? To nullify, so render it as if it didn't exist. And so, like, I'm looking at Margaret sort of nodding, right, as our Israelis in the room. One of the most famous times that this word appears in more common usage is around Pesach. So when you clean your house of chametz, where you're supposed to do a process, right, at which it's basically bitul chametz, you are nullifying the existence of chametz in your home, and you generally do that through burning it. Okay, so in Israel, like in Jerusalem, right before Pesach happens, you'll see bonfires and people like dumpster fires everywhere, where everybody's outside burning their chametz and bitul. Okay, in this case, what it is talking about, the number shishim is 60. So bitul b'shishim basically means that something cooked in more than if it represents 1/60th of the total volume, right? The thing that, let's say the questionable item is less than 1/60th of the total volume of the item is that you're going to eat, then it is bitul within it. It is nullified within it. It's as if it doesn't exist. So example, you're cooking a stew on the, on the stovetop. You're not paying attention. You accidentally knock in a tiny amount of creamer that happened to be located just above the stove, right?
Everybody keeps
Where
their
everybody
creamer.
keeps their creamer, right? I'm trying to use like this. It's not exactly a ham hock, above either. It's a little more complicated, right? But something basically that is of a small enough amount that when it's in a larger thing, it's as if it doesn't exist, right? And they pick shishim the way that rabbis pick lots of numbers, which is somewhat arbitrary and somewhat based on, a certain kind of logic. And if you think about a giant stew pot and try to imagine it divided into 60ths, right? The amount that we're talking about here is infinitesimally small, right? And almost definitely the amount that, unless it is a very pungent thing, will almost definitely, from a scientific standpoint, it's not that it ceases to exist. It just becomes so dominated by everything else, it's as if it doesn't exist. Okay, so in this case, you can already see where it goes. This is a helpful idea because you take a little bit of cells from something and you grow it into something that is more than 60 of its size. Presumably, it's lost its essence, and therefore it would be parv, right? Okay, not so simple. Okay, never so simple. Okay, so our next thing, davar chadash. Okay, this became a major consideration in the 1800s. When there was the Industrial Revolution allows for the industrial production of all manner of things, and the usage in particular of glycerin or other things that are glycerin-like in food products that are mass produced. Glycerin, for the most part, is something that is created from animals, right? It's hooves, all sorts of things that you don't even want to think about. But again, so infinitesimally small that it finds its way into all manner of product, including when I was a kid, Oreo cookies, which is why we couldn't eat Oreos and we could only eat Hydrox because Oreos were not kosher at the time. And it's why in my family lore of my great-grandfather giving the first hashgacha to Coca-Cola, the issue in Coca-Cola was the same thing, that there was a glycerin-like substance that basically really wasn't playing that important of a role, but it was there. And so the rabbis had to determine, what is this stuff? And is it acceptable for it to be used if it is made from meat? So I won't get into the gross details of this either, but most of the stuff that was being done at the time of the original tshuva was from grinding bones down, but grinding them down so much that they basically became, according to halacha, or according to the argument of this one rabbi, a davar chadash, basically a different thing, right? It's different than the bitul. It's not nullified. It's still an object. It still is from meat, but because it has been ground down and mixed with all manner of other things, it basically as if it is something new. Okay. So here again, one would make the argument so far we're building towards this is a parv thing, right? It is a tiny amount. It's nullified in a larger amount. And it is so radically changed from its original form via all the things that Anne was talking about that it's a davar chadash. It's a new object, and therefore it's considered something entirely different. And because it's not meat and it's not dairy, it's therefore parv, right? Parv is usually if it's not this or that, then it's parv. Now, of course, we run into the thing that throws it all off completely. And this is the principle of what's called ta'am ki ikar. And ikar is sort of like the essential point of something, and ta'am is flavor. So the argument is that while all of this stuff may be true, if the flavor of the thing is still the original thing, then it's still the original thing. But if its flavor disappears, right, if you don't know anymore what it is, then the ta'am ki ikar doesn't apply. So in this case, we run into a problem, which is that even if the original object's flavor has disappeared completely, right, the stem cells, the ground up, stuff that goes into the meat, whatever, the whole point of this thing is to end up tasting like a flank steak, right? So if in the end its flavor is that of the thing that it began as and it ends up as, then it doesn't matter if it's bitul b'shishim, and it doesn't really matter that it's a davar chadash, at least in some form or the other, because the ta'am ki ikar, the flavor is the thing that actually matters the most. And so that is the reason why I argued in my paper then, and I would still argue it today, that if this thing were to be done in a kosher fashion, that it would have to be considered meat like everything else, and you couldn't therefore put a piece of cheese on it and have a hamburger, a cheeseburger, or something like that. Okay, lastly, and then we'll get to Anna to more discussion, the question of the pork. And as I said, in some ways, that is the easiest one to know, even if you know nothing about halakha or any of the stuff that I just described, mostly because in the end, there is I have to find it here. Okay, this is what I want to read. So there, 30 seconds digression. The Talmud is sort of the first attempt of the rabbis to codify law and the discussion around that law. A bunch of time goes by, and then there is a series of codes of law that are created because people realized not everybody has, for example, 63 tractates of the Talmud sitting around and want to know the answer of what do you do to clean your house for Pesach. They just want one book that you can pull off the shelf that tells you those basic things. So Maimonides, Mishnah Torah, eventually the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is the most common. It's built off an earlier work that is written by a guy named Jacob ben Asher, and he writes something called the Arba'at Turim, the 4 rows. So the structure of the Shulchan Aruch is built off of his thing. And he argues basically that there is a larger principle at play, which is ein mavtilin isur lechatchila. So what it basically means, right? Ein mavtilin means you shouldn't cook isur, which is a non-permittable thing to eat, right? A non-kosher thing to consume. Lechatchila, basically from the beginning, right? Like it doesn't matter how many hoops you jump through. It doesn't matter if you're really only using the tiniest amount of progenitor cells of a pig. It doesn't matter if it's nullified in 60 times its thing. It doesn't matter if it's a new object. In the end, from the beginning, you shouldn't even do it because it is a prohibited animal, right? The Torah says very clearly, don't eat these kinds of animals. Therefore, all of the hoops in the world won't make it right for you to eat it. And that was the main reason why I argued in the end that it wasn't a question so much of even the science at that point, as it is another consideration in halakha, which is a siag Torah, like building certain fences around the Torah that you don't even want to get involved in attempting to cross over, right? And in this case, there is nothing, at least according to, again, a much more traditional standpoint, there is nothing to benefit the Jewish people by providing them with a means to eat pork around the laws that say don't eat pork. Okay. However, if we take that question off the table, again, the most interesting of them with the simplest answer, and we focus on really the first question and the second question to some degree, if there is a way for this to work, right? If there is a way to do what we've already described scientifically, which at this stage there is enough evidence to suggest that it's a matter of time, probably not a question anymore of science fiction. What does the Jewish world do with this information? Is there a reason to do this? And if so, is there also a consideration not to do this? And especially when you think about that from a religious standpoint, can we think about one of the main reasons why creating another living style object to eat might be problematic in a religious mindset? Who might we be? Yes, very good, Margaret, right? Creation, right? I mean, it is a form of playing God to some degree. And is that a good thing for the world and for Judaism? And those are some of those kinds of questions. So I think let's turn it over to Anne, let's turn it over to Judy, and let's talk a little bit about all this.
So my first question, okay, so Dan, I have to just say,
Yes, Michelle.
I'm going to capsulize what you said, which is like, if it tastes like chicken, it might as well be
Might as well be
chicken.
chicken.
Okay, so Anne, we have this in vitro meat. Is it nutritionally the same? Is it different? Is it comparable? Is it something you are going to say to your clients, this is okay for you to eat?
Well, the issue is that there's no nutrition facts on the products yet. They say that they're similar or like meat, but I searched high and low for a nutrition facts label, considering it has been available in the United States. There were 2 restaurants in the US. One was Jose Andres in his Chicago restaurant. He was serving chicken. And then there was a restaurant in San Francisco, Bar Cren, that was serving chicken as well. And they stopped serving them in the past year. And I could not find anywhere online that explains why it was taken off the market out of these restaurants, as well as the nutrition information. I was hoping, like, for tonight to be able to show you the nutrition label facts information about chicken and beef versus these products, but they're unavailable. And I think that the science is still in its infancy stage, and that it still has more, there seems to be very big investments. That's the sense I got. There is a lot of money behind this. Of course, associations like the Cattlemen's Association is very
much, right,
anti,
exactly.
very anti, and I'm sure this chicken
I'm sure you're
industry
right.
as well.
I'm sure you're
But
right.
look, the avian flu,
Right.
with chickens. Chicken is a very popular protein source in our country, very popular. If we didn't have chicken on our table, what would be the substitute for chicken? A lot of people, I know, I always say to my patients, are you clucking from eating so much chicken? They'll have chicken like in so many different, because it's such a versatile protein. But, I can't answer that question because there's not enough data available when I researched it.
And you mentioned avian flu. So if you are getting these biopsies from animals, there's got to be a whole regulatory system in place to find out, are we getting biopsies from healthy animals? Are the mediums that the tissue's being grown in, what is that coming from? And that's where I think the kosher or non-kosher gets really complicated, because every little factor, and also you and I had been talking about how some of these mediums are going to be an issue for people with like celiac disease or possibly other allergies or things that they need to consider. So the labeling has to be really astringent, far above and beyond a restaurant, labeling and letting you know that you're eating lab grown food. So, and I got to tell you, the idea of eating meat from an animal without the animal being involved in the process or minimally is bizarre. it is strange unless, we've really made a hash of things and we're all living underground and that's the only way we're getting,
Right, well, Fallout.
that's the only way
That's-
we're getting,
yeah,
chicken.
Sure.
But is there, do we know if there's sort of like the impact environmentally? Is that sort of like the plus from what you read?
Of course it is. Look at, cows, what the carbon footprint is, that is huge. So if you could grow something in 4 weeks, so cows, their feed is usually grass. It's supposed to be grass, except we grow them so that they grow fast. I mean, you can get grass-fed beef and it's very expensive because it takes more than 2 years. I don't remember exact numbers. I mean, I used to know and I didn't research it for tonight, but it was definitely more than 2 years. It might even be 3 years to get a cow to full growth. But if you feed them feed, which is, plant-based, like, corn, they grow within 18 months, they're to full weight. And the thing is that then you also get an animal that's going to have higher fat content. I mean, you get variations. So how is this all going to play out? I think there's more questions at this point than we actually have the answers.
Hmm.
Am I answering your question?
Yeah, no, I think so.
Oh, wait, so the environmental, that's what you're
Yeah.
asking. So, I mean, I would think environmentally, absolutely, from my reading, yes, that the sustainability, that it doesn't, because it doesn't take as long and it doesn't involve as much, gas and, transportation. It's just an easier way for us to have these animal proteins without basically almost not having the animal.
Right. And I think, it's interesting, as you noted, that there's an Israeli company that's involved in this. Some of that is just because Israel really is at the forefront of when there are new technologies and things like that. But the other reason is that when you think about a country like Israel, which has very minimal space to begin with, even less viable, ranching land for the kinds of animals that people generally like to eat. It's part of the reason why Israel, I think, still to this day eats more turkey per capita than anywhere else in the world, is because, things like turkeys and chickens is very different than beef. Beef actually for a very long time, rare to find it. And if you found it, it was, not top shelf to say the very least. But it's always a consideration in Israel for lots of things, how the land itself is used. And so if you have a circumstance where, not necessarily everybody in the society, but certain, parts of society are being fed in this kind of way, then you have probably less of an environmental consideration, but something of just a, geographic limitation of certain parts of the world that can't sustain those kinds of animals, and I think, especially for gigantic countries with huge populations, it's also a consideration for them in terms of being able to keep up with the demand. There is an ethical consideration about how animals are treated in the process, right? And that anytime, right, as Anna's talking about, in America, our desire to get it faster is both a monetary consideration, but it's also we're an impatient people, right? Nobody wants to wait 2 years to eat their steak. They want it now. And so if you have some means by which to guarantee that there is food that can be grown under, again, laboratory circumstances, production circumstances, you could answer a lot of society's challenges as well as environmental challenges in a pretty significant kind of way. And I think even if you looked at it and said, the goal in the next 100 years was for 20% adoption of this kind of meat as a primary protein, the impact on a global level would be significant. And by almost every account that I've read, very significant. So, there is an impetus for it to push past the yuck factor, as you said. But as we were talking about before, the question of how much yuck can one tolerate, unless we are in a Fallout type of scenario where we are all underground or on a spaceship out, which, the way things are going, depending on how the debate goes tonight, who knows? That's could be next steps, but Well, I think that the simplest way of this, I don't think so. I think actually what it's trying to do is to mimic what would happen in a normal body with those particular cells. in other words, the way that cells differentiate in general is that there is, a mechanism that tells a simple cell to become a bicep, right? Or to, whenever we're gestating and that sort of development that happens in vitro. So I think the real manipulation that happens is sort of exterior to that, not really on a DNA level. But your question is a fairly good question, because the logical next step is, well, okay, if we're doing this, might as well, right, engineer it to be higher in protein, lower in fat, tastier, whatever the things are. And it's almost an inevitability that if you open this particular door, you're probably opening a few other doors along the way too. So I think it's very good consideration, Susie. And I think, frankly, that question would go back right to what Margaret pointed out about, the sort of religious concerns about how much are we playing God here, and, whether, even if it's viable, is it right? And if it's right, is it right according to religious standpoint or a secular one? Those are all good questions.
So in terms of the DNA, I would think, because you're starting with a cell and you're just replicating the cell, growing the cells from that one cell, that using the same DNA would be what I logically would think, based on what I read, how they grow the cells. So they're starting with one cell or a couple of cells, and they're just using those to keep growing. And then it's the environment that it's grown in and what nutrients are provided. But the DNA, I don't believe would be changed. Well, that was genetically modified. You're talking about genetically modified corn, and that you're taking the DNA and you're changing. So that's different. That's genetically modifying the product. This isn't genetically modifying the product. It's taking a cell and it's growing the cell. So I don't believe, I mean, like I said, there's a lot of like marketing about it to get investors, but there's not enough substance to really understand the whole process.
I also think when a process is very complicated and you can't understand it, do you want to eat it?
That's
You know
great.
what I'm saying? Also, I just wanted to say, and
Great question.
please fact check this, to your heart's content. I'm not sure that there isn't DNA manipulation in meat processing that goes on with animals. So you might, in a weird kind of a way, be better off here.
Right.
And then another question is, if you could modify lab-grown meat to create meat that was higher in protein, more digestible, lower in cholesterol, and therefore help people live healthier lives, it becomes, again, this big ethical question of where's the trade-off, where's the balance? And then to put on top of that, there are all the practical concerns of what is going on with our population. How do we feed all these people? How do we take care of people? And the other thing that came to me kind of completely randomly is that I could actually see a future in which there is kosher lab-grown meat and non-kosher lab-grown meat, because it's about commerce.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So are you going to be eating this?
No, I don't eat meat regularly.
Uh.
But when you were talking about the glycerin, like a tiny amount, when I was talking about the cows, when a cow is fed corn or some kind of meal, not grass, I don't know if you realize it, they have to have antibiotic.
Right.
They have to have antibiotic because they have two stomachs and they are prone to infection as a result of eating. So even though they don't have to write it on the label,
Right.
it's an accepted fact. So, we're getting things in our food, in our milk, in our dairy, we don't even know about.
Right.
So,
And in order to avoid that, right, you have to have the finances to be able to afford the things that get around that, right? I mean, and that is another layer of the conversation too, is that a lot of this has to do with, the haves and the have-nots and who's getting what. Because you can imagine, again, a scenario where you work out all of these details, you produce this stuff, but the only people who eat it are the impoverished, right? And then a lot of times when that is the case, then people look the least at it to see, is it actually good for them, right? Is this actually beneficial, or is it just better for the bottom line? 90% of the time when you want to see the worst of what human beings can mass produce to eat, look at prisons and armies, right? And you will see again, historically, all manner of things that stretch out what should have been a normal amount into way more than that normal amount. And almost always there is a sort of, again, an ethical looking the other way while all of this is happening because of a meta consideration that says, right, well, either they starve to death or they eat sawdust, and the problem with that kind of ethical thinking is, you stop asking the question as to why was it a problem in the first place? Like, why wasn't there enough to go around? Who had too much? And so all of these kind of conversations become really existential as much as anything else. And I think, the questions that are being thrown out, for example, from a religious standpoint, I mean, what I would find fascinating would be if you were really able to present it as it's eat this or people die, what would the rabbis say? Right. And again, let's assume we've worked out all the kashrut stuff, right? The first principle of like, lechatchila, right from the beginning, maybe don't do this, right? Maybe it's just not a good idea. As we're talking about all the, playing God stuff, maybe not a good idea. But if it was a life and death consideration, right? Pikuach nefesh comes into the conversation and all of a sudden it's a real conversation to be had. And I suspect that, if it really, God forbid, it came to that situation, I think the rabbis actually would determine that it is something that is not only permissible, but necessary. But again, it's, the rabbinic thinking is oftentimes dealing in hyperbolic situations, things that are very unlikely to actually unfold, but trying to anticipate them in advance of, so that there is some kind of roadmap that should you find yourself in this situation, you can look to some other precedent to say this is acceptable or not acceptable. But I still think probably if you were dealing with it purely on an environmental level, it's too abstract a concept for modern rabbis to say okay in that circumstance, right? To suggest that it's going to affect global warming in a positive way is too abstract of a concept. It would have to be something like you have a whole bunch of people who would literally starve to death either eating this or not, and then that decision can be made. But I think otherwise it's too remote, right? It's too removed from things to make a broad consideration. But the ethics are very much there on a secular level and on a religious level for sure. Celia. Great question, Celia. They don't, but it's, but look, but I think what I would argue, and the reason why, again, I did it in this class, all these years ago, is that I think we should, right? Not necessarily because we operate in a world in which a rabbi or rabbis determine what we eat or don't eat, and not necessarily that we live in a world in which the sort of institutional, for lack of a better term, guilt that is associated with it is present. In that sense, there is no reason to care at all, right? But I would say that in the reform world, right, is one of the first places where you saw eco-kashrut come into consideration. So eco-kashrut is sort of an offshoot idea, which says, the considerations of the rabbis and the minutiae of the rabbis concerned with how an animal is shechted and things like that are not such a relevant consideration to most people anymore because, in most developed countries, the things that used to happen to animals don't presumably happen the same way. So, how am I to say that, a shechted animal in a factory in Iowa is a better off animal than an animal killed at the Purdue factory down the street? I don't know that I can make that argument, right? But an eco-kashrut person can look at it and say, well, what's the whole footprint of this thing I'm about to eat, right? How is this animal treated from birth to death? What is the environmental impact of it? How is it shipped from place to place? Right? Those considerations are ethical considerations. And so you end up with places like, for example, if you're looking for excellent kosher butchery online, Grow and Behold will charge you a fortune, but will ship you meat anywhere in the world. And theirs is excellent, but it meets a certain standard that goes above, frankly, what just standard kashrut does, because standard kashrut gets you the Rabushkin plant, which I don't know if any of you ever heard about this, but this was a whole terrible thing in which they were employing all manner of, illegal immigrants, underage people, terrible working environment. The whole thing got raided by the feds. It was a disaster overnight. It's like the second largest kosher butcher, in the country was, indicted. But again, all of that technically operating under the auspices of rabbis, trained rabbis, who again would say, that from the kashrut standpoint, things were done according to, kashrut. Look, half of the animals that are killed to be eaten in beef, I should say specifically, in Israel are grown in Argentina and then put on a boat alive and shipped to Israel to be shechted there. So you can technically fulfill the requirements of kashrut, but if you look at it from a removed perspective, right? And again, going back to the question about why, reform might care, whether any of our people are necessarily concerned about, whether they're eating kosher or non-kosher animals or whether they are a kosher stamp or not. I think most of them would feel uncomfortable if they knew that the burger that they just ate suffered, before it was killed. And I think those are considerations. And also I think in general that just because, Reform Judaism is a non-halachic stream of Judaism in the sense that halakha is not incumbent upon every individual to follow to the letter in order to be part of the group, it's not a non-halachic entity either, right? Most of what we do, 90% of what we do in this shul is derived from halakha, right? Our services and how we operate them, our kashrut practices here, most of what I am and how I behave, right? All of these things are driven by halakha too. But this particular question, Celia, I think is really probably more an intellectual exercise necessarily than a exercise in religious, considerations. But I think it's still a very great question to ask and a very valid one for sure. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
So we're maybe eating it, maybe not.
Yeah, I never answered whether I would eat it or not. Well, I think what I said to Ann and Judy before we walked in is that if you told me that I could eat something that I like and an animal doesn't have to die in order for that to be possible, then I would be on board for that. I think I think I could suspend my thinking on, mostly because I think I suspend my thinking on eating regular meat to a large degree, right? I'm not picturing in my mind that whole process to get that meat.
Lucy the cow.
Yes, exactly. Like I'm very much trying not to do that in order to eat. So I think at least in a theoretical case I would, but it's a real question of when I actually sat down to eat that piece of steak, would I go through with it? And I all I can tell you is I think the answer is yes, but I don't know. And I don't know if it'll be in our lifetime where it happens, but it's a great question.
Well, I think we're lucky because we all have choices.
Right.
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 We can all go home and most of us can go, I feel like, do I want this or do I want that? And you can open your refrigerator and you can open your cupboard, your pantry, and have a lot of choices. I think this could be an amazing option when we are in situations where we have fewer choices, but there's a part of me that goes, the connection between people and animals, that symbiotic relationship is deserving of a certain amount of respect that I think, Native Americans, indigenous people, understood that we will lose. And although the practicalities of like laboratory grown meat is very sort of intellectually beguiling, it seems like it's another step walking away from humanity rather than thinking, if we want to feed a lot of people, let's sit down and figure it out because we have a lot of food rather than growing it in the lab. So just sort of a little food for thought.
A little food for thought. Oh, I like this word.
Yeah.
Really very
We
good.
got a lot of puns.
Yeah.
Going plant-based. I mean,
Right.
that's the way to go. In that you can feed a lot of people, you can get adequate protein, you can get all the nutrients that you need from plant-based foods.
We want to just nutritionally, if we're thinking about doing the plant thing.
So you have legumes, and included in legumes, all beans, you have lentils, pulses, you have peas. People don't think green peas are a great source of protein. Yes, if you look at which burger is it? I think the Impossible. No,
Right. Yeah, it's right. That is pea
right,
protein.
that is
Right.
pea protein. You have tofu, you have, soy, which is again beans, but you have, soy products that are in different forms. You have tempeh, you have soy, and there's so many different things that you could do, as well as grains. People don't realize grains and vegetables have proteins in them. Fruit does not. Fruit's 100% carbs. There's no protein, there's no fat, but your grains do. So
And some vegetables,
Vegetables do, yes. Well, all vegetables have protein. All vegetables have protein, not as much as an animal protein source or a bean, but there is some protein. I mean, the average amount in like a half a cup of vegetables on the average would be about 3 grams of protein, 2 to 3 grams of protein. So depending upon how much you're eating, I mean, I think as a country, unfortunately, we are protein obsessed. I mean, I deal with this all the time in my practice, where when I ask someone about what did they eat, and I think I said this last year when I presented, when I asked them, what did you have for dinner? They only tell me about the protein. I don't really care about tell me everything else that you ate. I want to hear about the starch. I want to hear about the vegetables. So, and, and one of the things that I get from people is, well, oh, vegetables are really expensive. Think about the foods you put in your grocery cart. What's the most expensive item?
Meat.
The most expensive is your animal proteins. Your vegetables will never cost the same.
Right.
So that's the way that we could feed a lot. And the thing is, it doesn't take as long for certain vegetables to grow. I mean, I already have tomatoes coming up. I mean, they're green, but I have tomatoes. So, and it's just the end of June. So there are options. And the thing is that with beans, with soy products, there are so many wonderful recipes out. I mean, when I say to someone, well, have you tried tofu? And they're like, whoa, and I'm like, but there's so many great things that you could do with it. I mean, I just made last weekend a tofu masala with mushrooms and asparagus. That was amazing. I can do a General Tso's tofu that tastes like General Tso's chicken with the same sauce. I mean, because I eat mostly vegan.
Mhm.
I will eat fish, but on occasion, but I mostly eat vegan. I'm not protein deficient, nowhere near it. So you could survive without having strong animal sauces in your diet.
Do you have another question out there?
And also just
No.
for anybody who's online, if you want to put any questions in the chat, we'll see it here as well.
So, Rabbi Dan, you said you would eat the in vitro meat.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think
And
so.
not so much.
Right. But it wouldn't make any sense for
You know what? Like the Impossible Burger.
Huh?
I have no reason to eat it. I don't like the taste of beef at all. So you wouldn't get me to eat it, even if it's
Anyway, right.
cultivated, right? And from the picture that I saw of it, to me, it didn't look terribly appetizing.
Yeah.
The Olive Farms meat just looked, I don't know, look at it online.
Right. I think that's a big caveat, right? I mean, you'd have to really be putting the thing in front of me that I really couldn't tell was something.
Chicken parmesan.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Something along those lines. But, fair question. I think, one of the things to think about, though, is, if you try to picture in your mind's eye what society without meat looks like, right, it becomes almost impossible to imagine that scenario where it's completely disappeared. So I think in a lot of cases, it becomes a question about, if you're looking at it as sort of a pie chart, if right now meat consumption is 80% to 20%, but I mean, I'm just making up numbers, right? You look and see, what is the impact on people if that shifts by 10% or 20% or 25%. And I suspect that both on a nutritional level, on a health level, again, as Anne pointed out, since we don't really know what the other stuff will be that's mixed in with these cells, it really can't ever be exactly 1-to-1, right? That, or at least in our lifetime, it doesn't seem that's going in that direction. There'll always be these other things. And that's true of the Impossible Burger as well, right? If you open up a container of it and you look at its ingredient list, it is 50 different ingredients because that's the only way that it works at the moment. But if you broke that down, remember, like a lot of times when you look at an ingredient list, the first few ingredients are the ones that dominate it, right? They're the ones that are the largest percentage. When you start getting to the bottom of the list, you're really actually getting into the batal bashishim stuff, right? By rabbinic standards, some of this stuff wouldn't even be listed because it is so infinitesimally small. But FDA standards are something different, right? And FDA standards are ones that are going to say, so long as it is something identifiable, that it's meant to be there. But, the average person going to McDonald's is not looking at their nutrition list, and I don't think anybody has ever looked inside a McNugget, So, I mean, I think that's the thing for me intellectually is to say, like, if you really put the, a camera and watch the McNugget from beginning to end of its life, would you feel any better about that than what we're talking about here? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Right. But right. But that's precisely it. That's precisely it. And I think, something like, ground meat, for example, right? That's why Impossible and the other one Beyond, when they started, that was the first thing that they worked on, because that's the easiest thing to create, is something that really in the end is designed to be subsumed in other things, right? Drenched in a sauce of some kind or another. By the way, big pitch, if you like the vegetarian chorizo at Que Pasa, excellent. Very spicy, but very good. Okay, very, very good. You would really have no a way of knowing, but but again, that's playing to its particular strength. Outside of that, I don't know. I mean, a T-bone steak again, I think in our lifetimes is not going to happen. That seems so far away. But a bunch of in vitro ground meat that could be made for, as I said, I guarantee you, if it exists, the first place they'll test it on is soldiers and prisoners, like, for sure. But then you the question, like Susie said, right? If you're a family that is on very restricted finances and you have to feed 3 or 4 people or 5 people in a family, people are making those decisions all the time, right? It's not this, but it's some other decision that says, if I lived in an ideal world, I'd be eating vegetables, right? But in the end, the best I can get is V8, and that real, I mean, I remember I was somebody did a presentation on this once when I was in school on food deserts, right? It's the same thing, like we take for granted.
Yes.
If you're not familiar with that concept, it means that there are large parts of this country, forget everywhere else in the world, large parts of this country where the things we take for granted that we find in our local supermarket don't exist in the local supermarket of a person living in South Central LA. It may be a little bit different now. It's gotten a little bit better, but for a very long time, you didn't have 50 different vegetables to choose from. You didn't have fresh fruits. You really had hyper processed things, and that led to a very significant obesity epidemic in particular segments of American society, because they lived in food deserts where they couldn't get, or they couldn't afford, if there was something there, that it was beyond it. And these kinds of, again, ethical considerations, societal considerations, I think are very valid in both a religious space and a secular space, and are worth, again, going back to the question why it matters. I think are things that definitely have to be at the very least pursued. At the very least pursued, even if in the end, right, Judy, you're correct that everybody looks at it and says, no, thank you, right? That it seems logical, if we're going to try to put people on Mars, that solving some of the issues that we've always faced here, which is scarcity of, or at least presumed scarcity of resources. How do we deal with that? And I guess one last thing I would say when we were talking about environmental stuff, water. If you talk to a lot of people, they tell you, looking in the next 100 years, where they're most concerned, right? You wouldn't think about it, but unless there are, the Israeli technology for desalination, for example, unless that becomes widespread, you're really looking at a scenario in which more and more water is scarce. And if that's the case, things like cows in particular, far beyond. And then you get into a math game, right? Is it worth this for that? And then I don't know. No.
So there's one point I wanted to make that you reminded me of when you were talking, Rabbi, and that is, when you select a product to eat, look at the ingredients and ask yourself, is this something I have in my kitchen? Because when you look at
Right.
the ingredients on the Impossible Burger, they're not ingredients that you're going to have in your kitchen. So that's something that you want to take into consideration, because, they're chemically manufacturing. It's like a chemistry lab almost of products that are going into the food that you could possibly be eating and not really realizing it.
Absolutely. I think I learned that actually. I took a course in college that, typical to me, I thought was going to be easy because of the name, and turned out to be hard, but it was called Food Science 101, the science of food. And I thought, this is right up my alley. It turned out to be a very complicated class, but it was precisely in that vein. Right, exactly. It because you eventually realize that you have to be a chemist to even understand what it is that you're talking about. Half of these words aren't words that the average person can even pronounce. And, in some ways that is very mimicking of some of the reality of Judaism and its development, in that for a long time, right, rabbis held a certain kind of elite position because they could understand the minutia of the language that was being described. In other words, they could look at it and parse out what the Talmud was saying, but the average person in the room couldn't make heads or tails of it. So they were entirely dependent on someone else to tell them this is okay and this is not okay. And that still is true to a large degree, right? The average Jewish person living in Mea Shearim or living, in Borough Park, they are going to trust that the mashgiach, who oversees the food that they're eating at that restaurant, knows what they're doing and has ensured that not only the food itself, but the method in which it was, constructed and ultimately cooked is up to a standard that allows for the person to feel okay. And I think to some degree, that's what we experience when we go into the store and we buy a pack of Oreos and we don't look at it. Well, not Ann, right? But the rest of us who buy, a pack of Oreos, right? We don't even bother looking at it. We say, okay, it's in the store, it's in packaging, it says everything is okay. And it has a couple of stamps on it from something. But boy, when you look at the ingredients, Luke tells me that all the time. You look at the ingredients and you're like, man, I don't even know what 90% of this is. I really have no idea.
But I think there's
Yeah.
also a balance. All right. So it's not to say, I mean, I don't love Oreos, but I like M&Ms,
Right,
and there's food coloring in it,
right.
but I don't eat them all the time.
Right,
I
right.
think there's a balance that,
Right.
and I always kind of use like 80 to 90% eating healthy most of the time. And then the 10 to 20%, you let your
You
head
let
down
yourself,
and you
yeah.
kind of, indulge.
Right.
And that's the balance.
I think that's also a very, very classic rabbinic approach to things a lot of times too, right? Which is that, if you are overly strict about everything, the chances are you will break down eventually and the
Mhm.
long run won't serve you. So there is a need for a certain level of strictness and structure, with an understanding that we're still human beings and we need to, as you said, again, those that have hair, to let it down and enjoy themselves. But absolutely, I think that's right on.
So I think this conversation probably is to be continued in
Yeah,
the future.
I was
So-
gonna say, I think we'll have a
Right?
part 2 and a
You
part
know,
3 as we
I
get
think
closer,
as
but
as it develops,
Yeah.
I'm sure I have some closing.
yeah, sure.
If there is a part two, I've actually come around to the other way of thinking, which is that I would eat this under the right circumstances.
Ah, right.
If it gets me out to Mars, or if it means everybody gets to eat, then
Those are
I'm
two
all
good
for
ones.
it.
Right.
I think the question is always not what we are doing, but I mean, that's part of it, but why are we doing this?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I think different people are coming to this topic with different
Very much.
intention.
Very much.
So
Very
that
much.
might be the next thing of looking at
Mhm.
food from an intention point of view,
Very nice.
maybe from a Jewish intention.
Yeah, no, I think that's great.
Yeah. So
There's a lot of material for that for sure.
to be continued,
To be
most
continued.
definitely.
All right. Well, thank you,
Yeah.
everybody.
Yes,
And
thank you.
stay tuned. Also, we are planning in July and in August 2 more of our sessions. We were just talking about what July may be. Keep your eye out for perhaps Einstein making an appearance somewhere in July.
We
And
hope.
we hope.
We hope.
And then also very fascinating discussion in early August. And Steve, do you want to give a 30-second pitch to it? I'll hand you the mic.
Okay. The Templeton Foundation, which we got a $5,000 grant from for this series on science and religion, gave a grant of $2.5 million to a guy who is a Rhodes Scholar who's going to speak on August 1st, the results of a study of the efficacy of prayer. The question is, does prayer work? We all know it makes us feel good to pray for somebody who's sick. The question is, does it make the sick person feel better, whether or not the sick person knows he or she is being prayed for? And this guy has studied the problem. He has told me that if you pray for a loved one, a beloved person, and they know about it, there are measurable differences in the pulse rate, the blood pressure. There are metrics that show that there is some positive stuff. I just want to add a couple of footnotes. In the paper the other day, there was a story that in Denmark, because the cows and the pigs are flatulent and emit gas, the owners of those animals in Denmark have to pay a tax. Sidebar. The other thing I wanted to say, I started thinking about getting on an airplane and trusting that the pilots have been properly trained. They're not doing drugs or alcohol. They're not fooling around with the airline hostesses and all of the things you have to trust in order to take an airplane. And if you really think about it, you will never take an airplane again. And if you think about your life as some logical thing, you won't cross the street either, because there's one chance in a billion you'll get hit. So I'm finished.
I use that actually all the time, and I use it also with elevators. Just even something as simple as an elevator, right? You get into an elevator, like somebody did the physics on this, right? Somebody did the math, and it's going to work, and I'm okay about that. But if you really stop and think about it for a second, you're like, okay, some part of this is pretty insane. But airplanes, I think, is definitely the best example, because when you really stop and think about it, I mean, it's unless you really understand trigonometry and certain very arcane, it really makes no sense. I'm sure that's true. You know what? There is probably some halakhic consideration with that too, for sure. Well, anyway, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Judy, again for moderating. Thank you, Anne, for being a part of this. And anybody that's more interested in the halakhic part of this and wants to read my paper, you let me know. I'll be happy to send it to you. And one of these days, we'll get Dr. Gray out here to corroborate. Okay. Yes, I was going to say, and may we all survive whatever is to come in the next few hours. Okay, take care, everybody.